She didn't go looking for trouble. She just did her job. But the moment Elena Brooks opened that filing cabinet on her very first day at Titan Core Logistics, she set off a chain reaction that would bring down one of the most powerful corporations in the country. What she found wasn't just a mistake, it was a lie buried 20 years deep, signed with a name that shouldn't have been there. And the woman running this empire, she wasn't going to let a brand new hire walk out of that building with the truth. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit like and drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The offer letter had arrived on a Tuesday, and Elena had read it 4 times before she believed it. Senior Systems Analyst, Titan Core Logistics. Starting salary that made her stomach flip. She'd printed it out and stuck it to her refrigerator, which she hadn't done with anything since she was 9 years old, and brought home a spelling test with a gold star on it. She was 31 now, and the gold star feeling was the same, that ridiculous, embarrassing warmth in the chest that you try to talk yourself out of because you're too old to be this excited about anything. She told herself to be cool about it. She was not cool about it. Titan Core wasn't just a company. It was the company in industrial logistics, the outfit that had quietly engineered the warehouse automation systems running in 43 states, the platform that moved everything from medical supplies to automotive parts through a network so precisely calibrated that a single delay anywhere in the chain sent ripple effects across 3 time zones. If you'd bought anything online in the last decade that arrived on time, there was a reasonable chance Titan Core's infrastructure had something to do with it. They didn't advertise. They didn't need to. Elena had spent 6 years at a mid-tier consulting firm grinding through compliance audits for companies that considered spreadsheet organization a competitive advantage. She was good at it, better than good, but the work had the nutritional value of plain crackers, and she'd known for 2 years that she was staying out of inertia more than anything else. The Titan Core recruiter had reached out in March. By April, she'd passed 3 rounds of interviews. By May, she had the letter on her refrigerator. She started on a Monday in June, which felt right. The Titan Core headquarters occupied the top 11 floors of a glass tower in downtown Harwick, a mid-sized city that had reinvented itself twice in the last 30 years and was currently in the middle of a 3rd attempt. The lobby had the hushed, expensive quality of a place that didn't need to impress anyone but did it anyway. Dark marble, indirect lighting, a reception desk staffed by 2 people who moved with the particular efficiency of people who'd been trained rather than hired. Elena checked in, got her badge, and was escorted to the 14th floor, where a man named Derek Holt met her with a firm handshake and the slightly distracted energy of someone juggling too many things at once. "Good timing," Derek said, leading her down a corridor lined with glass-walled offices. "We've got a systems review coming up in 3 weeks, and I've been carrying most of it solo since Renata left." "Who's Renata?" "My last analyst. She got a better offer." He said it without bitterness, which Elena respected. "Her loss, honestly. This project is the most interesting thing I've worked on in 5 years." "What's the project?" "Infrastructure certification audit. Full sweep of the warehouse management system architecture, the original design documentation, the maintenance logs, compliance sign-offs, the whole stack. We're preparing for a regulatory filing in Q3 and everything has to be airtight." Elena nodded. This was exactly the kind of work she knew. "What am I starting with?" Derek stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. It was a records room, not a storage closet, but an actual room with a long table, 2 workstations, and floor-to-ceiling shelving units packed with binders and archive boxes organized by year. The smell was that particular combination of old paper and climate control that Elena associated with deep institutional memory. "Start with 2019 through 2022, Derek said. "Cross-reference the maintenance certifications against the original design specs. Flag anything that doesn't match. I'll check in at noon." He left, and Elena stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at the shelves. She got to work. For the first 2 hours, everything was exactly what she expected. The documentation was dense but organized. Binders labeled by system module, maintenance logs cross-referenced with certification dates, engineer sign-offs on the relevant pages. She built herself a tracking spreadsheet, worked through the 2019 stack methodically, found 3 minor discrepancies in maintenance scheduling that were almost certainly clerical, flagged them, moved to 2020. The coffee Derek had left her went cold. She didn't notice. It was in the 2021 binders that she found it. She almost missed it. The documentation for Module 7, the load distribution subsystem, one of the more technically complex pieces of the original architecture, had a full certification packet stapled to it, and the sign-off page at the back was dated March 14th, 2021. Standard format. Engineer name, license number, signature. The name was Nathan Brooks. Elena's hand stopped moving. She knew that name. She'd known it since her job interview when one of the panel members had mentioned, almost in passing, that Titan Core's warehouse management system was built on a foundation designed by an engineer named Nathan Brooks, who had co-founded the company in the early 2000s and departed, circumstances unclear, sometime around 2006. His architectural framework was still the spine of everything Titan Core ran. His name came up in the industry the way certain names always do, not frequently, but with weight. She looked at the signature again. Then she pulled out the 2020 binder and found another certification on Module 7. Different date, same name, same signature. She pulled the 2019 binder, same name, same signature. She sat back in her chair and looked at the wall for a moment, thinking. Then she pulled out her phone and did something she probably should have waited to do. She searched for Nathan Brooks, Titan Core, an engineer in the same query, and scrolled until she found a professional profile from an industry directory that included a scanned copy of his professional engineering license. The signature on the license did not match the signatures in the binders, not even close. Elena sat with that for exactly 4 minutes before she made a decision she'd think about many times afterward. She photographed every page, every certification, every sign-off, every date. She did it methodically, hand steady, not letting herself think too hard about what she was doing or why, just moving through it the way she'd learned to move through audit work. Document first, interpret later. She had 37 photographs by the time she heard footsteps in the corridor. She put her phone in her jacket pocket and had her hands on the keyboard when the door opened. It wasn't Derek. Celeste Mercer was 54 years old, and she looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that looking like anything other than exactly herself was a waste of energy. She was tall, with steel gray hair cut bluntly at the jaw and a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Elena's first car. She came into the room without announcing herself or waiting for an invitation, the way people do when they've spent enough years at the top of an organization that the concept of waiting for an invitation no longer registers as applicable. She looked at Elena. Then she looked at the binders on the table. "You're the new analyst?" she said. Not a question. "Elena Brooks. I started this morning." Something moved across Celeste's face, fast, almost invisible, but there. "Brooks?" she repeated. "Yes." Celeste walked to the table and picked up the 2021 binder. She flipped to the Module 7 certification page with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where it was. She looked at it for 2 seconds, then set it down and looked at Elena. "What did you find?" Elena had been in enough rooms with enough difficult people to know when the air changed. It had changed. "I was just starting to cross-reference the maintenance logs," she said carefully. "I flagged a couple of discrepancies in the 2019 stack. Scheduling gaps, mostly." "That's not what I asked." The temperature in the room felt different. Elena couldn't have explained it precisely. Nothing visible had changed. Celeste was still just standing there. But something in the quality of her stillness had shifted, and Elena felt the specific animal awareness of being looked at by someone who was assessing her as a problem. "I'm not sure what you mean," Elena said. Celeste put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something that wasn't quite quiet and wasn't quite loud, but landed somewhere in between that made Elena's chest tighten. "I want to be very clear with you, because you are new here and you don't know how things work yet. This department handles sensitive proprietary documentation. People who handle sensitive proprietary documentation and develop misunderstandings about what they've seen or who talk about what they've seen before they have full context, those misunderstandings have a way of becoming very expensive for the person who had them. Elena didn't say anything. "Do you understand me?" Celeste said. "I understand you," Elena said. Celeste straightened up, smoothed the front of her blazer, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back. "Welcome to Titan Core," she said, and left. Elena sat in the records room for another 40 seconds without moving. Then she took a slow breath and thought about the 37 photographs on her phone, and the signature that didn't match, and the way Celeste Mercer had walked directly to the Module 7 binder without looking at anything else on the table. She thought about what it meant that the CEO of Titan Core Logistics had come to a records room on the first morning of a new analyst's first day, alone, within 2 hours of that analyst starting work. She thought about the name on the certifications. Nathan Brooks. No relation. At least not that she knew of. Brooks was not an unusual name. She'd checked. When the interview panel mentioned it, she'd checked. Because of course she had. And found nothing that connected her family tree to a structural engineer who'd co-founded an industrial logistics company in the early 2000s. Different Brooks. It was a coincidence. It was probably a coincidence. She gathered her materials, organized the binders back in their places, shut down the workstation, and walked out of the records room with her jacket buttoned over her phone. Derek found her in the break room at noon, staring at a cup of coffee she'd poured but hadn't drunk. "How's it going?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Good documentation practices, clean organization." She paused. Celeste Mercer came by. Derek's expression did something complicated. "She came to the records room?" "Yeah." "To see you specifically?" "She didn't say. She looked at some of the binders and left." Derek was quiet for a moment, and Elena watched him decide something. "That's not normal," he said finally. "She doesn't come to this floor." "How often is not often?" "I've been here 4 years. I've seen her twice. Once was a company event." He set down his coffee cup. "Did she say anything?" Elena looked at him. This man she'd known for 2 hours, who seemed decent, who'd been straightforward with her, who was also an employee of Titan Core Logistics and had been for 4 years. "She introduced herself," Elena said. "Very professional." Derek nodded slowly in a way that suggested he didn't entirely believe her, but wasn't going to push it. "She went back to the records room after lunch and worked until 5, and she was careful and she was thorough, and she did not take any more photographs. What she did was memorize. By the time she left the building, she had the structure of the problem as clearly mapped in her head as she could get it without more time and more access. The certifications on Module 7 spanning at least 3 years, signed with Nathan Brooks's name, using a signature that didn't match his professional license. The certifications were renewal documents, the kind required to maintain active compliance status for a system of that complexity. Without valid certifications, Titan Core's warehouse management system would not be legally operable under federal industrial safety regulations, which meant that either the certifications were genuine, in which case Nathan Brooks had signed them himself, or they were forged, in which case Titan Core had been operating a system across 43 states on falsified compliance documentation for at minimum 3 years. The implications of the second option were large enough that she didn't want to think about them too hard while still in the building. She took the elevator down, crossed the lobby, walked through the revolving door into the early evening, and kept walking until she was 2 blocks away. Then she stopped on a corner and stood there while the after-work foot traffic moved around her, and she thought about what to do. She had 37 photographs. She had a discrepancy that was either a bureaucratic error or the edge of something much worse. She had the memory of Celeste Mercer leaning across a table and telling her, in language that was technically civil and functionally a threat, to be careful about what she thought she understood. She thought about calling the consulting firm she'd left, asking if she could come back. She thought about what 6 years of compliance auditing had taught her about what documentation irregularities usually meant and what they occasionally meant, and how rarely the occasionally turned out to be nothing. She took out her phone and looked at the photographs. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She opened a search engine and typed, "Nathan Brooks, structural engineer, Titan Core co-founder, current location. The results were thin. Industry directories, a few old conference program listings, one brief mention in a trade publication from 2008. But in a professional engineering registry database she'd used for past audit work, she found an active license record. Current address listed as a small city called Delman, 3 hours north. Active, not retired, not deceased. Nathan Brooks was still working somewhere, which meant someone had been signing his name to documents he hadn't signed. Elena stood on the corner for another minute. Then she started walking to her car. She had photographs. She had a name. She had 37 reasons to be very careful about what she did next. And one reason, much quieter but harder to ignore, to do something about it anyway. The drive to Delman took 3 hours and 12 minutes, and Elena spent most of it talking herself out of turning around. She'd left Harwick at 7 in the morning, before the Titan Core tower would have its lights on, before Derek would be at his desk wondering where his new analyst was. She'd called in sick. A text to Derek, brief and vague, the kind of message that invites no follow-up. And she'd packed her laptop, her notes, and a printed copy of Nathan Brooks's engineering registry listing with the Delman address on it. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, which was either sensible caution or the beginning of a decision she couldn't take back, and she wasn't sure yet which one it was. The photographs were backed up to 2 cloud accounts and a USB drive she kept in her glove compartment. She'd done that at midnight, sitting at her kitchen table with the kind of focus that only comes when your brain has decided that sleep is not currently on the agenda. Delman turned out to be the kind of place that looked like it had been a bigger deal 50 years ago and had since settled comfortably into smallness. A main street with a hardware store, a diner with good window signage, a post office that shared a building with a notary. The residential streets off the main drag were quiet and tree-lined, the houses old but maintained, the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' cars. The address from the registry was a house on Callaway Street, a 2-story Craftsman with a detached garage and a truck in the driveway that had seen better decades. Elena parked across the street and sat there for a moment, looking at it. She'd built up some version of Nathan Brooks in her head on the drive up, the kind of image you construct from fragments, an industry legend who'd walked away from his own company for reasons nobody seemed to want to talk about. She'd expected something more austere somehow. A man who'd engineered complex systems for a living, who'd co-founded what became a billion-dollar company, living in a craftsman house in a small city with a beat-up truck in the driveway. She got out of the car. The man who answered the door was 63, maybe 65, with the kind of build that suggested he'd been physically active most of his life and had recently become more sedentary without fully adjusting to it. Gray hair, cropped short, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was holding a coffee mug and wearing a flannel shirt with a small paint stain on the left sleeve, and he looked at Elena with the cautious attention of someone who rarely got unannounced visitors. "Nathan Brooks?" she said. "Depends on who's asking." "My name is Elena Brooks. I'm a systems analyst. I started working at Titan Core Logistics yesterday, and I need to show you something." The caution in his face shifted into something harder and more alert. He looked past her at the street, a quick scan, almost reflexive, and then stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was organized the way engineers' spaces tend to get organized, functionally, with no particular concern for aesthetics, and with a clear system that would look like clutter to anyone who didn't understand the system. There were bookshelves along most of the living room wall, technical manuals mixed with history books, mixed with what looked like several years of trade publications. A drafting table in the corner with something on it that Elena didn't look at long enough to identify. He cleared a stack of papers from the couch and gestured for her to sit, then pulled a chair from the drafting table and sat across from her. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She'd organized the photographs into a sequence on her laptop. The certifications in chronological order, 2019 through 2021, Module 7 each time, the name and the signature on everyone. She turned the screen toward him and let him scroll. He didn't say anything for a long time. He scrolled through slowly, and she watched his face, and what she saw there wasn't quite the shock she'd expected. It was something more like the expression of a man confirming something he'd suspected for years, and had hoped, in some tired and private part of himself, he was wrong about. You pulled these from the certification binders, he said. Not a question. Yes, records room, 14th floor. And Celeste knows you were in there. Elena paused. She came to the room while I was working. She didn't say anything directly about the certifications. Nathan set the laptop down on the coffee table and leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She threatened you. She made a comment about misunderstandings being expensive. Yes. He exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. That's her version of a warning shot, he said. She usually saves the real artillery for later. You know her well. I knew her 20 years ago. People like Celeste don't change what they are. They just get better at managing the parts of themselves they don't want people to see. He looked back at Elena. These signatures, those aren't mine. I know. I checked your license profile. Where did you find a copy of my signature? Engineering registry. The profile has a scanned version of your original license application. Something in his face shifted. Not quite approval, but a recalibration. He was looking at her differently now. You came up here without telling anyone. Yes. That was either very smart or very stupid. I'm still working that out. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Brooks, he said. Is that coincidence? As far as I know. He nodded slowly, accepting it without pushing further. How much did you see in that room before she came in? Enough to know it wasn't just Module 7. The structure of the filing suggested the pattern repeated across multiple modules. I only had time to photograph the 2019 through 2021 stack for Module 7. But the binders for Modules 3, 5, and 9 were organized the same way. Same certification format, same sign-off page layout. Nathan was quiet. He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it, set it down without drinking. I left Titan Core in 2006, he said. The split wasn't clean. There were disagreements about the direction of the company. I wanted to slow down expansion and do a full safety audit of the system architecture before we scaled it further. The board, with Celeste's support, decided that wasn't a priority. He paused. I had a 30% stake in the company. The buyout was structured in a way that was technically legal and practically punishing. I signed the paperwork because I was tired and I wanted out, and because I told myself the system was solid enough that they couldn't break it just by being greedy. Were you wrong? I don't know yet. That's the problem. He looked at the laptop screen again. If they've been forging renewal certifications, it means the system hasn't been properly recertified, which means every maintenance modification, every software update, every hardware change they've made since 2006 has been implemented without a licensed engineer signing off on its safety implications. For a system operating in 43 states, Elena said. Yes. The word landed in the room and sat there. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There's something else, Nathan said. When I designed the system, I built a licensing mechanism into the core architecture. Not a kill switch. That's too blunt. More like a compliance lock. The system checks against a master certification record held under my engineering license, and if that record goes unverified for more than a certain period, the system flags for review. I designed it as a safeguard, in case the company ever tried to operate without legitimate certification. The idea was that it would create a paper trail that couldn't be ignored. Elena looked at him. Did Titan Core know about it? The board knew in theory. I disclosed it during the sale negotiations. I don't think they understood what it actually meant at the time, and by the time they might have figured it out, I think they assumed it was dormant. Is it? He was quiet for a beat. It's been dormant. I never activated it because I kept telling myself the situation didn't warrant it. I kept thinking there was a less drastic way to handle things, or that someone inside the company would eventually catch the problem and fix it. He looked at her steadily. You're the first person who's come to me from inside that building with actual documentation. In 16 years. Elena let that settle. What does activating it do? It places a formal hold on the certification status of the entire system. Under the terms of the original licensing agreement, which is still legally binding regardless of the buyout, a hold from the primary license holder triggers a mandatory review period. Titan Core would have 24 hours to present valid certification documentation or face an automatic operational suspension. And if they can't present valid documentation, they can't. That's the point. Nathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. They've been forging my signature. They don't have valid documentation because there is no valid documentation. Activating the hold would start a clock they can't stop. Elena sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a car went by on Callaway Street, and somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and stopped. "Why haven't you done it already?" she asked. "If you've suspected this, because I wasn't certain, because activating it without solid evidence would have looked like a disgruntled former partner trying to sabotage an ex-employer. I needed documentation, real documentation, from inside the system." He looked at her photographs again. "Which is what you brought me." Go. Nathan made calls that afternoon from his kitchen table, and Elena sat nearby and listened, and what she heard rearranged her understanding of who this man was. The first call was to a woman named Harriet Voss, who turned out to be a retired federal compliance attorney with a voice like weathered oak and the attention span of someone who'd spent 40 years reading fine print for a living. Nathan explained the situation in under 3 minutes, and Harriet asked 5 questions that were so precise they made Elena's head hurt a little, and then said, "Send me the photographs. I'll have a preliminary assessment by tonight." The second call was to a man named Marcus Webb, who was a forensic document examiner based in Claremont, with a practice focused on engineering and corporate documentation fraud. Nathan and Marcus clearly knew each other. The conversation had the shorthand quality of a long professional relationship, and by the end of it, Marcus had agreed to review the signature samples against Nathan's license records and provide a certified forensic opinion within 48 hours. The third call was shorter. Nathan gave a name that Elena didn't recognize, said 4 sentences, and hung up. "Who was that?" she asked. "A contact at the Federal Industrial Safety Commission," he said. "Not an official contact. A person I've known for 15 years who will make sure the right people are paying attention when we file." Elena nodded. She felt, sitting at that kitchen table in Delman, the way you feel when you realize that the current you stepped into is moving faster than you thought. "I need to go back," she said. Nathan looked at her. "I need to go back to Titan Core. If I disappear after one day, they'll know something's wrong. They'll move faster on whatever they're trying to protect." She paused. "And I think there's someone else inside that building who might be willing to talk." "Who?" "There's a senior auditor in the compliance division, Naomi Carter. Her name was on some of the internal review documents I saw in the records room, not the certifications, the maintenance logs. The way her notations were written, the specific language she used, it read like someone who was documenting carefully, more carefully than the job required, like someone who was building a record." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant read to get from maintenance log notations." "I've been doing compliance audits for 6 years. I know what careful documentation looks like when someone's trying to protect themselves, and I know what it looks like when someone's trying to protect the truth. It's not the same thing." He held her gaze for a moment. "Careful," he said. "Don't approach her directly at Titan Core. Assume the building has eyes in places you won't expect." "I know. And Elena," he said her name with the weight of someone who didn't use names carelessly. "What you did this morning, driving up here, bringing this, I want you to understand that it changes things, for you specifically. Once I activate the hold, Titan Core is going to look for the leak. They'll find it fast because you were the only new person in that records room." "I know that too." "Then you should also know that I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you have legal protection before that happens. Harriet Voss will have a whistleblower filing ready, but the window is narrow." Elena looked at him. At this man she'd met 4 hours ago, in his flannel shirt with the paint stain, in his house full of technical manuals, and the quiet particular to people who spend most of their time thinking, at the way he hadn't tried to minimize what she was walking into, or dress it up, or tell her it would be fine. She picked up her keys. "I'll be back in contact tomorrow," she said. She drove back to Harwick in the dark, and she was halfway there before her hands started shaking on the wheel. Not fear exactly, more like the delayed physical response to a high-wire decision that her nervous system hadn't been consulted on. She gripped the wheel tighter and let it pass, and by the time she hit the city limits, she was steady again. She went to the office the next morning. She brought coffee and a notebook and the expression of a person who had been mildly unwell yesterday and was now fine, thank you for asking. Derek bought it, or pretended to. Celeste did not appear. The compliance division was on the 12th floor, and Elena had no legitimate reason to be on the 12th floor, so she found one. The company's internal document management system required cross-divisional access requests for certain archived files, and she put in a request mid-morning that would route her to the 12th floor to pick up physical access approval from the compliance office. It was the kind of bureaucratic move that was so boring it was almost invisible. Naomi Carter was at her desk, a compact woman in her mid-40s with the focused, slightly tired look of someone who worked too many hours by choice rather than obligation. She had a red pen behind one ear and a stack of folders on her left that was approximately the same height as the stack on her right, which said something about the pace of her work. She took Elena's access request form, looked at it, looked at Elena. "You're the new analyst on 14, she said. "Started Monday." Naomi stamped the form without looking at it again. She held it out. And then, in a voice that had gone carefully flat, "How was the records room?" Elena took the form. She kept her face neutral. "Thorough documentation," she said, "very organized." Naomi nodded. She looked back at her desk. "Watch yourself up there," she said, and the two of them were quiet for exactly 1 second, and in that second there was a conversation that neither of them had out loud. Elena took her form and left. Harriet Voss called Nathan at 9 that night with her preliminary assessment, and Nathan had Elena on the line, and what Harriet said took 12 minutes and left a particular kind of silence in its wake. "The photographs are consistent with a pattern of systematic certification fraud," Harriet said. Her voice was the same over the phone as it had been before. Unhurried, precise. The voice of someone who'd stopped being surprised by corporate malfeasance sometime in the 1990s, but had never stopped being angry about it. "If Marcus's forensic analysis confirms the signature discrepancy, and based on what I'm looking at, it will, you have the foundation for a fraud case that covers federal safety violations, falsified regulatory filings, and potentially securities fraud if Titan Core is carrying these certifications on any compliance representations to investors." "How many certifications are we talking about realistically?" Nathan asked. "Based on the pattern in these photographs and the timeline you've described, I would estimate you're looking at a minimum of 40 to 60 falsified documents, possibly significantly more, depending on how many modules and how many years." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Nathan," Harriet said, "the compliance lock you described, are you ready to activate it? I need Marcus's report first. I need the forensic confirmation on record before I pull that trigger." "That's 48 hours. "I know." "In 48 hours, if anyone inside Titan Core connects what Elena found to the photograph she took, they'll start destroying records." "I know that too." "Then you also know that the longer you wait, the more they can clean up." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Well, I've been waiting 16 years to do this right," he said. "I can wait 48 hours to do it correctly." Harriet accepted that. "I'll have the whistleblower filing ready for Elena's signature by tomorrow afternoon. Once that's in, she has formal legal protection." Elena had been listening to this exchange from the other end of the call, sitting at her kitchen table in Harwick, 60 miles from Delman, in an apartment that suddenly felt much less like home than it had a week ago. "What happens to the people who work in the warehouses?" she asked. "If the system gets suspended, what happens to the workers?" Harriet paused, as if the question was not one she'd been prepared for at that moment. "The suspension would apply to the automated management system," she said. "The warehouses themselves wouldn't necessarily—" "The warehouse operations depend on the automated system for load management, scheduling, and safety coordination," Elena said. "If the system goes down without proper transition protocols, you're looking at potential safety incidents on the floor. Workers get hurt when the system fails uncontrolled." Another pause. Nathan spoke this time. "Elena's right. That's why the compliance lock isn't a kill switch. It triggers a review period with a mandated transition protocol. The system goes into a safe standby mode, reduced operations, manual override active. It's designed to protect people during the process, not put them at risk." "You designed it that way," Elena said. I designed everything that matters about that system, Nathan said quietly. That was always the first consideration. The call ended 20 minutes later with a plan and a timeline and a set of instructions from Harriet that Elena wrote down in her notebook in the same careful, methodical handwriting she used for audit notes. She looked at the page afterward, the list of steps, the sequence, the names and their roles, and thought about what it meant that a week ago she'd had a gold star feeling about a job offer, and now she was sitting in her kitchen at 10:30 at night writing down instructions for how to legally dismantle a billion-dollar corporation. She thought about Naomi Carter and Watch Yourself Up There, and the particular silence of someone who knows something but hasn't yet found the person they're willing to say it to. She thought about the workers in 43 states who showed up every day to warehouses running on a system certified by a signature that didn't exist. She closed her notebook. Marcus Webb's forensic report arrived 41 hours later, and it was 41 of the more uncomfortable hours Elena could remember spending. She went to Titan Core both days. She did her work. She cross-referenced maintenance logs and flagged scheduling discrepancies, and ate lunch at her desk and said good morning to Derek and acted like a person whose world had not recently shifted significantly on its axis. On the second day, she saw Celeste Mercer in the elevator. Just the two of them, 12 floors, the specific discomfort of a small enclosed space with a person who had already told you, in the most corporate language possible, that you were being watched. Celeste looked at her. Feeling better? She said. Much better. Thank you. Good. Celeste looked at the floor numbers ticking up. We have high expectations for the analyst position. I hope you're finding the work meaningful. I am, Elena said. Wonderful. The elevator stopped on 14. Celeste did not get off. As the doors closed, she looked at Elena one more time, and whatever was in that look, it wasn't warmth, and it wasn't exactly threat either. It was something more calculating than either. It stayed with Elena for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus's report came in at 6 in the evening on the second day, to Nathan's email, CC'd to Harriet. Elena read it on her phone, parked in the Titan Core garage before she drove home. The report was 11 pages. The conclusion was 3 sentences. The signatures on the certification documents were definitively not consistent with Nathan Brooks's authenticated signature profile. The variation patterns indicated deliberate replication attempts rather than natural signature drift. In Marcus's professional opinion, the signatures had been produced by a single forger working from a reference copy of Nathan's original license application. Elena sat in the parking garage and read those 3 sentences twice. Then she called Nathan. I got it, he said. He'd clearly read it already. Are you ready? She asked. A brief pause. Not hesitation. Something more like the breath before a decision that's already been made. I'm activating the hold tonight, he said. Harriet has already filed your whistleblower documentation. As of this afternoon, you have federal protection. Elena leaned her head back against the headrest. And Titan Core has 24 hours. Yes. What do you think they'll do when they get the notification? Nathan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of a man who has been thinking about something for a very long time and has stopped feeling surprised by his own conclusions. I think Celeste will do what Celeste has always done, he said. She'll try to fight it. She'll mobilize the legal team. She'll call in every favor she has at every regulatory body she's ever worked around. And when none of that works, she'll start looking for someone to blame. He paused. And I think she'll land on you. Elena looked at the concrete wall of the parking garage, at the flickering fluorescent light in the corner that had been flickering since Monday, and clearly wasn't anyone's maintenance priority. I know, she said. Are you all right? She thought about it honestly. I'm not scared, she said. I know that's probably the wrong answer. I should probably be scared. Being scared doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. It usually means you understand the situation clearly. Then I'm probably both, she said, doing the right thing and understanding the situation. Nathan did something then that surprised her. He laughed. A real laugh, short and dry and entirely human. Yeah, he said. That sounds about right. He activated the compliance hold at 11:47 that night, and Titan Core Logistics received the notification at 11:48, and the clock that Nathan had built into the architecture of his own system 20 years ago, the clock that nobody at Titan Core had believed he would ever actually start, began to run. By midnight, the lights in the executive suite on the 23rd floor were on. The notification that Titan Core's legal team received at 11:48 was 4 paragraphs long, written in the specific language of engineering licensing law that most corporate attorneys spend their careers hoping never to encounter in a live situation. It cited the original co-licensing agreement from 2003, Section 14, subsection C, which granted the primary license holder, Nathan Brooks, P.E., the right to initiate a compliance review hold on any system operating under his engineering certification. It stated that a hold had been initiated. It stated that Titan Core had 24 hours to present valid certification documentation to the Federal Industrial Safety Commission's review office in order to maintain operational status. It stated in the final paragraph that failure to present valid documentation would result in an automatic suspension of the warehouse management system across all operating facilities. Titan Core's general counsel, a man named Philip Rast, read the notification 3 times at his desk at home, in his bathrobe, at 12:15 in the morning. Then he called Celeste. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been awake. "Philip," she said, "you've seen it." "I've seen it." Her voice had the quality of someone who is angry in the particular way that anger becomes when it's been compressed into something very cold and very controlled. "I need options. I need them in the next 2 hours. Celeste, the licensing agreement is, I know what the agreement says. I was in the room when it was signed. I need to know how we fight it." Philip Rast had been Titan Core's general counsel for 9 years, and in 9 years he had navigated labor disputes, regulatory inquiries, 3 separate civil suits, and 1 near miss with a federal contractor audit that had required a level of creative legal interpretation he still wasn't entirely comfortable with. He was good at his job. He was also, at 12:15 in the morning, in his bathrobe, aware that what Celeste was asking him was not the same as the question she'd asked before. "The agreement has an arbitration clause," he said carefully. "We could file for an emergency stay on the hold pending arbitration review. That would buy time." "How much time?" 48 to 72 hours, if we can get a sympathetic judge." "Get one." "Celeste." He stopped. Chose his next words with the care of a man walking on ice he hasn't tested. "If the certification documentation isn't valid, an emergency stay only delays the outcome. It doesn't change it." A long pause. "The documentation is valid," she said. Philip Rast said nothing. "File the stay," she said, and hung up. He sat in his kitchen for a while after that, looking at the dark window above the sink, and thought about a conversation he'd had with Naomi Carter 8 months ago, which he told himself at the time was not his problem. He thought about it now with the specific discomfort of a man who has been telling himself something isn't his problem for long enough that the telling has become its own kind of problem. Then he got dressed and went to file the paperwork. Elena found out about the emergency stay at 6:45 in the morning when Nathan called her. She was already awake, had barely slept, which she'd expected, and she was sitting at her kitchen table with coffee she'd made too strong, and when her phone rang, she picked it up before the second vibration. "They filed for a stay," Nathan said. "Philip Rast, on behalf of Titan Core. Harriet got the notification 20 minutes ago." "Does it hold up?" "Harriet says it won't survive review. The licensing agreement's arbitration clause doesn't apply to compliance holds initiated under federal safety regulations. It's a delay tactic." A pause. "But it tells us something." "They don't have the documentation," Elena said. "No, if they had valid certifications, they'd have submitted them last night. You file a stay when you need time to manufacture a defense. You don't need time if you have the truth already." Elena looked at her coffee. "How long does the stay delay things?" "Harriet is contesting it this morning. Her estimate is we lose between 6 and 18 hours depending on how fast the court moves, which means the 24-hour clock effectively becomes 30 to 42 hours. He paused. "Elena, I need you to do something difficult today." "Naomi Carter." "Yes." She'd been thinking about Naomi since the night before, about watch yourself up there and the way the woman's voice had gone carefully flat, the specific blankness of someone choosing their words with the precision of a person who has learned the hard way that the wrong words in the wrong building can end a career. I can't approach her at Titan Core, she said. You told me that. Not at Titan Core. She lives in the Westfield neighborhood near the park. Harriet found her home address through public records. If you can reach her before she goes in this morning, what do I say to her? Tell her the hold has been activated. Tell her what's coming, and ask her what she knows. He paused. If she's been documenting carefully for the reasons you think she has, then she's been sitting on something she hasn't been able to use. Give her a reason to use it. Elena finished her coffee in one long swallow, which she immediately regretted because it was too hot and too strong. Okay, she said. The Westfield neighborhood was 20 minutes from Elena's apartment, and she drove it in 15, and she parked in front of a yellow duplex on Fenner Street at 7:20 and sat there for a moment telling herself this was a reasonable thing to do and mostly believing it. Naomi answered the door in work clothes. She'd been getting ready, clearly, jacket on but earrings not yet in, one in her hand. She looked at Elena on her doorstep, and her face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession, none of which were surprise. I figured it would be you, Naomi said. Can I come in? Naomi stepped back from the door. The inside of the duplex was organized the same way Naomi's desk was organized, purposefully, with the barely controlled order of a person who had too much to manage and had gotten very good at managing it anyway. There were folders on the kitchen table, not Titan Core folders. The colors were different, the format was different. Personal files. Elena looked at them and then looked at Naomi. You've been keeping your own copies, Elena said. Naomi put her earring in. She did it with the methodical attention of someone who needed a moment to decide how much to say, using the small physical task as cover. I've been an auditor for 19 years, she said. You want to know what 19 years of compliance auditing teaches you? What? It teaches you the difference between paperwork that's been filled out and paperwork that's been filled out correctly. She sat down at the kitchen table. Sit down. Elena sat. I found the first problem in 2020, Naomi said. Module 3, recertification filing. The signature on the engineer's sign-off didn't match the signature on file in our internal record system from 2018. I flagged it internally. My supervisor at the time told me the discrepancy was a known issue. Nathan Brooks had changed the way he signed his name after a hand injury, and the internal records hadn't been updated. She looked at Elena evenly. I believed it. Or I decided to believe it, which isn't the same thing, but I needed it to be true because the alternative was something I didn't have any way to handle yet. What changed? 2022. Module 7, Module 9, Module 5. 3 recertifications in the same quarter, all with the same problem. And the story about the hand injury didn't stretch to cover 3 modules in 3 months. Naomi looked at the table. I went back through the records I had access to and found the pattern going back to at least 2019, possibly earlier, but the older records had been moved to restricted archive access, and I couldn't get to them without raising flags. Why didn't you report it? The question sat between them for a moment, and Naomi's face did something complicated, not defensive, more like the expression of someone revisiting a decision they've already examined from every angle and are tired of examining. I'm a 52-year-old woman in a senior position at a company where the CEO has fired 3 compliance officers in the past 8 years, she said. 2 of them signed NDAs. One of them tried to go to the state labor board and spent 2 years in litigation before settling. She paused. I have a daughter in her 2nd year of college. I have a mortgage. She stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds like someone in a very difficult position, Elena said. Naomi looked at her. Don't be kind to me about it. I knew what was happening, and I built myself a very careful paper trail, and I sat on it for 2 years waiting for someone else to be brave first. The word came out with the particular weight of someone using it against themselves. You were in that records room for 2 hours on your first day, and you drove to Delman the next morning. I've been in this company for 7 years. Elena didn't say anything. It wasn't the moment for consolation, and Naomi wasn't asking for any. The hold has been activated, Elena said. Nathan Brooks filed it last night. Titan Core has now probably 30 to 40 hours to present valid certification documentation to the FISC. Naomi was very still. They can't, she said. No. Because the certifications don't exist. No, they don't. Naomi looked at the folders on her table. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the street outside. Someone's car starting, a bird doing something persistent in a tree near the window. What do you need from me? She said. Whatever you have, whatever you've been building for 2 years. Elena leaned forward slightly. The forensic analysis confirms the forgeries. We have the certification photographs. What we don't have is the internal documentation that shows Titan Core's leadership knew specifically, acted deliberately, rather than just failed to notice. If you have records of internal flagging, of conversations, of directives to cover up or dismiss, I have 6 memos, Naomi said, written by me to my former supervisor, dated between 2020 and 2022, flagging the signature discrepancies and requesting review. I have his written responses to 4 of them. I have a recorded phone call from March of 2022, in which he told me directly that the certification issue had been reviewed at the executive level and determined to not require further action. She paused. I have an email from Celeste Mercer's office, sent 2 weeks after that call, informing me that my access to the archive filing system had been restricted due to a departmental restructuring. Elena looked at her. You recorded a phone call. I'm in a 2-party consent state. The call was conducted on the company system, which carries a recorded line disclosure. It was legal. Naomi said it without particular satisfaction. I covered myself very carefully for 2 years. I just didn't do anything with what I had. You can do something with it now. Naomi reached for the folders. Her hands, Elena noticed, were not entirely steady, but they were moving. By 10 in the morning, Elena was back in her car outside the Titan Core tower, with Naomi's documents photographed and uploaded to the same cloud accounts as the certification photographs, and Naomi was inside the building at her desk, doing her job with the particular focused calm of a person who has made a decision and is now waiting for the consequences of it to arrive. Nathan had an 11 o'clock call with Harriet and a representative from the FISC named Director Alan Cho, who had the measured, slightly careful voice of a federal official who had not yet decided how seriously to take a call from a retired engineer about a compliance hold on a major logistics corporation. By the time Nathan finished laying out the documentation, the forensic report, the certification photographs, the internal memos, the recorded phone call, the email from Celeste's office, Director Cho's voice had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. The careful had remained. The measured had not. Mr. Brooks, Cho said, I want to be precise about what you're presenting. You're asserting that Titan Core Logistics has been operating a federally regulated warehouse management system across multiple states under falsified engineering certifications for a period of at least 3 years. At minimum 3 years, Nathan said, possibly longer. The pre-2019 records are in restricted archive access that we haven't been able to examine. And the system in question is currently active. It's currently under my compliance hold, which places it in review status. The system is still running in reduced capacity mode. The architecture doesn't allow for immediate hard shutdown, which I designed deliberately to prevent exactly the kind of safety incident that an uncontrolled system failure would cause in an active warehouse environment. A pause. You designed the shutdown protocol too. I designed everything that matters about the system, Nathan said. That's the point. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that comes when a person on the other end of a line is writing something down. I'm going to need certified copies of everything you've described. I'm also going to need to speak with the auditor, Naomi Carter, directly. She's aware and willing. And the analyst, Elena Brooks, also aware and willing. All right, Director Cho exhaled slowly. Mr. Brooks, I want you to understand that we take a compliance hold under Section 14C very seriously. I also want you to understand that Titan Core filed an emergency stay this morning, which is currently being reviewed. Until that stay is resolved, the formal clock on the hold is paused. I'm aware. Harriet Voss has already filed a challenge to the stay. Cho said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite anything else Elena could identify from her position listening in. I've worked with Harriet before. The stay won't survive past this afternoon. He was right. The stay was overturned at 2:47. The clock restarted at 2:48. Titan Corps' response to the stay being overturned was immediate and multi-pronged in the way that only a corporation with a large legal budget and a genuine panic response can achieve. Philip Rast filed 2 additional motions before 5 o'clock, one challenging the jurisdiction of the FISC over the specific licensing agreement, one asserting that Nathan's compliance hold authority had been voided by the 2006 buyout agreement. Both were legal arguments that had a surface coherence and a structural fragility, the kind of motions you file when you need to be doing something and the things that might actually work are not available to you. At 4:30, Derek called Elena into his office and closed the door, which he had not done before. He looked uncomfortable in a way that was specific and recent, the look of a man who has been told something he didn't want to know and is now trying to figure out what to do with it. There's been a directive from the executive floor, he said. Effective immediately, all access to the records room requires dual authorization. Anyone who accessed the room in the past 2 weeks is being asked to submit a log of everything they reviewed. Elena kept her expression neutral. Okay. Elena? He leaned forward slightly. I need to ask you directly. The work you were doing on Monday in the records room, did you find anything unusual? She looked at him, at his slightly loosened tie and his tired eyes, and the way he was holding the edge of his desk like something to steady himself on. Derek Holt was not a bad person. She'd been able to tell that from the first day. In the unscientific but usually reliable way you can tell these things about people you spend time near. He was also a Titan Corps employee who had been here for 4 years and had a mortgage of his own, in all likelihood, and a life that was woven into this company's structure in the way that lives get woven into things when you're not paying careful attention. I found some scheduling discrepancies in the 2019 maintenance logs, she said. I flagged them in my notes. Derek held her gaze. He knew she wasn't giving him everything, and she could see him decide not to push it. If anyone from legal or executive calls you, he said carefully, you don't have to answer questions without representation present. I want you to know that. It was the most he could offer her without putting himself at risk, and she understood that. Thank you, she said. She left his office and went back to her desk and pulled up her work files and stared at them for 20 minutes without doing anything useful, and then her phone buzzed with a text from a number she'd saved under the name HV. They've sent a preservation demand to your personal email accounts. Don't delete anything. Don't respond. I'm handling it. She put her phone face down on the desk and took a breath. At 6 in the evening, with 14 hours left on the compliance hold clock, Nathan drove from Delman to Harwick. He hadn't been to Harwick in 11 years. He didn't make a point of thinking about that. It was just a fact, something to walk through rather than around. But the city had changed in ways that were visible enough to register. New buildings in the financial district, a construction crane over the east side. The Titan Corps Tower, which had been glass and steel ambition when he'd last seen it, and was now just a building with lights on at the wrong hours. He met Elena at a diner called Patton's on the west side of downtown, the kind of place with laminate menus and coffee that came automatically, and a noise level that made it easy to have a conversation nobody else was going to overhear. Harriet joined them by phone, her voice coming through the small speaker of Nathan's cell propped against the sugar dispenser. The FISC has opened a formal investigation, Harriet said. Director Cho moved fast. I think the recorded phone call was the piece that pushed it from serious concern to active case. That call puts executive-level awareness on record in a way that's very difficult to argue around. What does the formal investigation mean for the hold? Nathan asked. It means the hold is now supported by federal investigative authority, not just your licensing rights. Even if Titan Corps found a judge willing to grant them another stay, the FISC can independently order operational review. You've essentially handed the situation to a body with more authority than either of us. And the system suspension? If Titan Core doesn't present valid certification by 9/17 tomorrow morning, the system goes to full compliance suspension. Given that they can't present what doesn't exist, that's what's going to happen. A brief pause. Nathan, when the suspension executes, walk me through exactly what happens in the warehouses. Nathan had been waiting for this question. He'd been thinking about it since Elena had asked it on the phone 2 nights ago, because it was the right question and he wanted to make sure his answer was correct, not just technically, but actually. The system enters a controlled standby protocol, he said. It doesn't cut power or kill active equipment mid-operation. It sends a sequence shutdown signal that completes all active load movements, parks mobile equipment in safe positions, and activates the manual override mode. Workers on the floor will see a system alert, operations supervisors will receive a protocol notification, and the facility will shift to manual operation procedures. He paused. Every Titan Core warehouse should have manual operation procedures in their emergency documentation. Whether those procedures are current and whether supervisors know how to execute them, that I can't guarantee. That's on Titan Core's operations management. Is there a safety risk during the transition? There's always a risk during any system transition in an active warehouse. I designed the standby protocol to minimize it, but I designed it in 2003, and I don't know what modifications they've made to the system architecture since then without proper certification. The table was quiet for a moment. Elena was watching Nathan's face, the way he said that last part, the particular flatness of it, the acknowledgement that his own system had been in someone else's hands for 16 years, and there was no way to know exactly what they'd done to it. The FISC has the authority to coordinate with warehouse facility managers directly, Harriet said. I've already flagged this to Director Cho. He's arranging for FISC safety coordinators to be on site at the 12 largest Titan Core facilities by 6 a.m. tomorrow. Nathan nodded. That's the right move. It is. The credit for suggesting it goes to Elena. Elena looked up. Nathan looked at her too. You called Cho? Nathan said. I emailed Harriet last night, Elena said. I just said what I said on the phone, that the worker safety piece needed to be addressed specifically and not assumed. Harriet handled the rest. Nathan looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating something. Then he picked up his coffee. Good, he said. At 8:15 that evening, Titan Core launched its first direct attack. Elena was still at the diner when her phone rang with an unknown number, and she answered it because she'd been answering unknowns all day. And the voice on the other end was a man who identified himself as senior legal counsel for Titan Core, and spoke with the smooth, pressurized confidence of someone who spent a significant portion of their professional life making people feel like they were in trouble. He told her that Titan Core had reason to believe she had accessed and transmitted proprietary corporate documents without authorization, which constituted theft of trade secrets under state law and potentially federal law as well. He told her that Titan Core was prepared to pursue all available legal remedies unless she agreed to return any copied documentation, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and provide a sworn statement that she had not shared any Titan Core materials with third parties. He asked if she understood what he was saying. I understand, she said. I'm going to give you my attorney's contact information. A brief pause. Miss Brooks, I want to be clear that this situation can be resolved very simply. Harriet Voss, Elena said, and read out Harriet's number from the contact in her phone. She's expecting your call. She hung up. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised to notice this. Nathan was watching her from across the table. Legal? He said. Trade secrets threat? NDA offer. He nodded slowly. That means they've confirmed it was you. They've connected you to the hold. I figured they would. Harriet will handle the legal contact, but Elena... He set down his coffee cup. They're going to escalate this. The lawsuit threat is the first move. If it doesn't work, they go after your credibility. Professional reputation, employment history, anything they can use to make the documentation look like the product of someone with a personal agenda. Elena looked at the table. I know. And they may go after Naomi. She's been there 7 years. They'll have more material to work with. I called Naomi this afternoon. She knows. How is she? Elena thought about Naomi Carter sitting at her kitchen table with her folders and her unsteady hands and the word brave used against herself like a verdict. She's scared, Elena said, but she's not backing down. Nathan was quiet. Outside the diner window, Harwick moved through its evening. People walking, cars at the light, the ordinary texture of a city that didn't know its largest employer was burning from the inside. I've been thinking about what happens after, he said. After the suspension, after the investigation, Titan Core employs 4,000 people directly, tens of thousands more in the supply chain. I've been thinking about that too. The company isn't the problem. The system isn't the problem. The problem is the people who decided that falsifying safety documentation was an acceptable cost of doing business. He looked at her. If the system can be properly certified, actually certified, with real engineering review, most of what Titan Core does doesn't need to stop. It just needs to be done correctly. Elena looked at him. Are you thinking about what I think you're thinking about? I'm thinking about a lot of things, he said. But yes. The night moved slowly, the way nights do when you're waiting for something large to happen. Elena went home at 10 and lay on her bed without sleeping and listened to the buildings settle around her. Nathan drove back to Delman because Harriet had paperwork for him to sign in the morning and because there was nothing useful he could do in Harwick except sit in the dark feeling the weight of what he'd set in motion. Naomi Carter sat in her home office until 1 a.m. organizing her documentation into the format that Harriet had specified for FISC submission, working through the folders she'd spent 2 years building with the patient, grinding attention of a woman who was done being patient for someone else's benefit and was now being patient entirely for her own. At 3 a.m., Titan Core filed an emergency injunction in federal court seeking to void the compliance hold entirely, arguing that Nathan's licensing authority had been extinguished by the 2006 buyout. It was their most serious legal move and also, as Harriet said when she called Nathan at 3:15 to tell him about it, their most desperate one. The buyout agreement voided his ownership stake, Harriet said. It did not void the licensing co-authority. That's in Section 14C of the original agreement, and it was written there specifically because Nathan insisted on it. Titan Core's own lawyers signed off on that language in 2003. Will the court see it that way? They will when I'm done explaining it to them. Give me until 8. She was done at 7:42. The injunction was denied at 8:09. Nathan heard the news in Delman, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee he'd made correctly because he'd had time to pay attention to it, and he looked out the window at Callaway Street in the morning light and felt something he didn't have a perfect word for. Not triumph, not relief exactly, more like the particular settling that comes when something you've been holding in tension for a very long time finally lands where it was supposed to land. The compliance hold clock hit 0 at 9:17. Titan Core Logistics had not presented valid certification documentation because there was no valid certification documentation to present. The warehouse management system entered controlled standby protocol across 43 states. In 12 major facilities, FISC safety coordinators were already on site. Operations supervisors received protocol notifications. Manual override procedures activated. Workers on the floor saw the system alerts and looked at each other across the warehouse floors and waited to see what their supervisors were going to tell them. In the Titan Core Tower in Harwick, the lights had been on all night. At 9:18, the first of Titan Core's major lending banks froze the company's primary credit line pending regulatory review. At 9:31, a large distribution partner issued a formal contract suspension. At 9:47, Titan Core's liability insurance carrier notified the company that coverage was under review given the active federal investigation. Philip Rass sat in his office and looked at the notifications arriving in sequence and thought about the conversation he'd had with Naomi Carter 8 months ago, and the decision he'd made that it was not his problem and what that decision had cost. 3 floors above him, in the executive suite, Celeste Mercer stood at the window and looked out at Harwick and said nothing. The city moved below her, ordinary and indifferent, the way cities are when something collapses inside a glass tower and the street-level world hasn't yet registered that anything has changed. It would register soon. The emergency board meeting was called for 2 o'clock that afternoon, which gave everyone involved approximately 4 hours to decide whose side they were on. That calculation was not metaphorical. In the hours between the system suspension at 9:17 and the meeting notice that went out at 10, Titan Core's 8-member board of directors received, in various combinations, calls from their personal attorneys, calls from the company's institutional investors, calls from 2 separate federal agencies, and in 3 cases, calls from journalists who had somehow already gotten the broad outline of what was happening and wanted comment. The board members who had been in the dark about the certification fraud, and most of them had, because Celeste's management style had always operated on a need-to-know architecture that kept the board informed of what she wanted them to know and nothing else, were now experiencing the specific, nauseating vertigo of people who have just realized that the ground they've been standing on was not what they thought it was. 2 of them called Philip Rast. He told them, with the careful language of a man who was already thinking about his own exposure, that the situation was serious and that they should have independent legal counsel present at the afternoon meeting. One of them, a board member named Gerald Fitch, who had been on Titan Corps' board for 11 years and had the leathery, seen-everything effect of a man who'd sat through enough corporate crises to have developed a clinical detachment toward them, called Nathan Brooks directly. He'd gotten the number from the FISC notification, which had listed Nathan as the initiating party on the compliance hold. Nathan took the call in his car, parked outside Harriet's office in Delman. "Nathan," Gerald said, "it's been a long time." "Gerald, I assume you know why I'm calling. I assume you're calling because you want to know how bad it is." A pause. "Is it as bad as the federal investigation notice suggests?" "It's exactly as bad as the federal investigation notice suggests," Nathan said. "The certifications are forged. They've been forged since at least 2019. We have forensic confirmation. We have internal documentation showing that compliance concerns were raised and deliberately suppressed at the executive level. The FISC has the full package." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Celeste?" The directive to restrict the auditor's archive access came from her office. The phone call in which the certification issue was characterized as resolved at the executive level. Celeste was the executive level. Another pause. Longer. "What do you want out of this, Nathan? Honestly." It was a direct question, and Nathan gave it a direct answer. "I want the system properly certified. I want the workers in 43 states operating in facilities that are actually safe. I want the people who falsified documentation for 4+ years to be held accountable for that." He paused. "I don't want money. I don't want Titan Corps back. I built the thing once. I'm not interested in doing it again." Gerald absorbed that. "I'll be at the 2 o'clock meeting," he said. "I know." For what it's worth, I didn't know. Nathan looked at the steering wheel. "I believe you, Gerald. That's almost worse." Elena heard about the board meeting from Derek at 11:15, which meant the internal communications had gone wider than the executive floor. Derek came to her desk with his jacket on and the expression of a man who had decided something and was going to say it before he changed his mind. "There's a board meeting at 2, he said. "I don't know the full agenda, but I know your name is going to come up in it." "How do you know that?" "Because Philip Rast's assistant called the 14th floor at 10:45 looking for your employment file." He looked at her. "Elena, I don't know what you found in that records room, and I'm not going to ask again. But if the company is about to do what I think they're about to do, you should not be in this building." She looked at him. This man who had been decent to her since the first morning, who had carried a systems review alone since his last analyst left, who had told her she didn't have to answer legal questions without representation and probably hadn't told anyone else he'd done it. "I appreciate that," she said. "But I'm going to stay." Derek opened his mouth. "I have legal protection," she said. "My attorney has been in contact with federal investigators since yesterday. If I leave now, it looks like flight. If I stay, it's documentation that I was here, doing my job, right up until whatever they're planning." He closed his mouth. Then, "Is there anything I can do?" "Go to the 2 o'clock meeting if you can get in," she said. "And remember what you see." He nodded, once, and left. Elena called Harriet at 11:30 and told her about the meeting. Harriet already knew. FISC had notified her office that they would have a representative present. Then Elena called Nathan, who was already driving to Harwick. "You're coming?" she said. "Gerald Fitch called me this morning. He wants me available." A pause. "I wasn't going to come. Then I thought about sitting in Delman, waiting for phone calls while this plays out, and I decided that was worse." "You haven't been to Harwick in a long time." 11 years, he said it without inflection. "It's just a city. Right, Elena said. I'll be there by 1. Basi. The Titan Core boardroom was on the 23rd floor, one floor below the executive suite, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing east and a table long enough to seat 20 people. At 2 o'clock it seated 12, the 8 board members, Philip Rast, 2 outside legal counsel retained by the board on short notice, and Celeste Mercer. Celeste had been in the building since before 6 that morning. She had not gone home. She was wearing the same charcoal blazer she'd had on yesterday, which was the only visible evidence of that fact, and she sat at the head of the table with the particular composure of a person who has decided that composure is the only weapon they have left, and they are going to use it until it stops working. She opened the meeting herself. I want to address what's been characterized as a compliance crisis, she said, because I think the framing that's being applied to this situation by outside parties is significantly distorted from the reality. Gerald Fitch, sitting third from her right, said, Celeste, the FISC has opened a formal investigation. The warehouse system is in suspension. 2 of our major banking partners have frozen credit lines. I'm not sure the word characterized is doing the work you need it to do right now. A small silence. The compliance hold was initiated by a former partner with a long-standing personal grievance against this company, Celeste said. The forensic analysis he's submitted is based on documentation accessed illegally by an employee who was on her first day of work and had no authorization to remove materials from a restricted records environment. That employee filed whistleblower documentation before she accessed any of our legal team, said one of the outside counsel, a woman named Andrea Solis, who had been retained by 3 of the board members jointly and had clearly done her reading on the plane over. She has federal protection. The access question is not the vulnerability you want to lead with. Celeste looked at her. The documentation she photographed is now in the hands of the Federal Industrial Safety Commission, along with forensic analysis from a certified document examiner and internal audit records provided by your own senior compliance auditor. Andrea Solis said it without heat, the way you say things when you're getting paid to be precise. I've reviewed the package. It's substantial. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Nobody stood up or raised their voice. But something in the air changed, the way it had changed in the records room when Celeste had put her hands flat on the table and leaned forward. Only this time the direction was reversed. The certification issue, Celeste began. Celeste. Gerald's voice was quiet. I spoke with Nathan Brooks this morning. I've been on this board for 11 years. I want to give you the opportunity to tell me directly. Did you know the certifications were forged? The boardroom was very still. Celeste looked at Gerald. Then she looked at the table. Then she said, the certification process was managed by the operations division. My involvement was limited to, that's not what I asked, Gerald said. She stopped. Did you know, he said, same quiet voice, that the renewal certifications for the warehouse management system were being signed with Nathan Brooks's name without his authorization? Another silence. It was 5 seconds long and felt considerably longer. I was aware that the certification renewal process had complications, Celeste said. I was told by operations leadership that the issues were being resolved through appropriate channels. By complications, Andrea Solis said, do you mean that your senior compliance auditor flagged signature discrepancies in writing on 6 separate occasions between 2020 and 2022, and that those flags were dismissed at the executive level on your authority? Celeste's jaw tightened. That characterization? There's a recorded phone call, Andrea said. March 2022. Your VP of Operations, whom you appointed, told the auditor the issue had been reviewed at the executive level and required no further action. 2 weeks later, an email from your office restricted that auditor's archive access. She looked at Celeste without expression. That's not characterization. That's a timeline. One of the board members, a man named Robert Cahill, who had not said anything yet, pushed his chair back slightly from the table, and the small movement had the quality of a man creating distance from something. Celeste saw it. Elena, watching from the hallway through the glass wall, Harriet had gotten her observer access, technically, saw Celeste see it, and saw what it cost her. The allegations being made by outside parties are legally contested and premature, Celeste said, and her voice was still controlled, still carrying the compression of a woman who had managed rooms full of difficult people for 20 years. What I'm asking this board to do is allow the legal process to proceed without precipitous action that could further destabilize the company. The company's credit line is frozen, said Robert Cahill, from his slightly greater distance. Our largest distribution partner has suspended our contract. Our liability carrier is reviewing coverage. The FISC has federal investigators on site at 12 facilities as we speak. He looked at her. How much more destabilized do you imagine we can get? If the board acts rashly, I want to call for a vote, Gerald said. Celeste looked at him. Gerald, I want to call for a vote on immediate suspension of the CEO pending the outcome of the federal investigation, Gerald said, and his voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. I think we all know this is where we are. I don't see the point in prolonging it. Philip Rast, who had been sitting to Celeste's left and had not said a word for 40 minutes, looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man counting the cost of things he'd done and hadn't done. I'll second, said Robert Cahill. Bob. Elena watched through the glass, and she did not feel what she'd expected to feel. She'd thought she might feel something larger, vindication, or the specific satisfaction of watching something unjust get corrected. What she actually felt was tired and a little hollowed out, and aware of the fact that the 12 people in that room had their own versions of this story that were not the same as hers, and that what was happening to Celeste Mercer right now, whatever she deserved, was still a person's life coming apart in front of other people. That didn't make Celeste blameless. Elena was clear on that, but it did make the moment feel less like a victory and more like a reckoning, which was different in ways that were hard to articulate and real. The vote was 6-2, with Philip Rast abstaining. Celeste stood when the count was announced. She stood the way people stand when they've decided that the way they leave a room is the last thing they can control. Straight-backed, deliberate, the charcoal blazer still without a wrinkle. She looked around the table once, briefly, not making extended eye contact with anyone. When she got to the door, she saw Elena through the glass. For a moment, they just looked at each other. A week ago, Celeste had leaned across a records room table and told her, in the most corporate language possible, that misunderstandings were expensive. Elena had been in the building for 2 hours. She'd had 37 photographs in her jacket pocket. She'd kept her face neutral and her voice even, and walked out of that building with everything Celeste had been trying to protect. Now Celeste pushed through the door and walked past her without speaking, and the charcoal blazer moved down the corridor with the particular speed of someone going somewhere they hadn't decided on yet, and Elena watched her go. Nathan was in the lobby when Elena came down. He'd been there since 1:30. He'd gone up to 14 briefly, looked at the records room door from the corridor, not gone in, come back down. He was sitting in one of the lobby chairs with his coat on and his hands in his pockets when she came out of the elevator, and he looked up at her and read her face. Done? He said. 6-2. She's suspended pending investigation. He nodded slowly. How are you? Complicated, she said. Yeah. He looked at the lobby. The dark marble, the indirect lighting, the reception desk staffed by people who were pretending not to have heard about the board meeting. I remember the day this building opened, 2008. Celeste threw a party on the 23rd floor. I wasn't invited, obviously, by that point, but I saw the photos. He paused. She built something real on top of what I built. Whatever she did to protect it, that doesn't make the thing itself not real. Elena looked at him. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. He stood up. What happened in there? All of it? They found a coffee place 2 blocks from the tower. Not Patton's, a different one, closer. And Elena walked him through the 2 hours in the boardroom. The timeline Andrea Solis had laid out. Gerald Fitch's question and the 5-second silence that had followed it. Robert Cahill pushing his chair back. The vote. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The recorded phone call, he said. That was the piece that made the difference. Naomi built it over 2 years, Elena said. She knew what she was building. She just needed someone to go first, Nathan said. Elena didn't answer that because she didn't need to. What happens to her now? Nathan said. Naomi. She's on paid administrative leave pending the internal review. Harriet says that's standard procedure when an employee is a witness in a federal investigation involving their employer. It's technically protective. Whether Titan Corp honors that protection or tries to pressure her through it depends on who's running the company in the next 48 hours. Gerald will push for interim leadership from outside the existing executive structure. He said as much this morning. Nathan looked at his coffee. Philip Rast is going to have a difficult few months. He knew. He suspected. There's a legal distinction, though not much of a moral one. He paused. He abstained from the vote. That's not nothing. It's also not a lot. No, Nathan agreed. It's not. At 4:15, three things happened in a sequence that felt coordinated but wasn't. It was just the way dominoes fall when enough of them are already leaning. First, Titan Corp's largest institutional investor issued a statement announcing they were reviewing their position in the company pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The statement was 4 sentences long and written in the careful language of institutional finance. But what it said, in the plainest possible translation, was that the smart money was watching the exits. Second, a vice president in Titan Corp's operations division named Carl Breyer, who had been the VP who made the phone call to Naomi Carter in March of 2022, the one that had been recorded, retained independent legal counsel and within 2 hours of doing so had opened conversations with the FISC about cooperation. Harriet got word of this through Director Cho's office at 4:40. She called Nathan. He's going to give them the internal chain of command, she said. Everything he was directed to do, and by whom. His attorney is already calling it executive-directed suppression. That puts it in Celeste's lap formally, Nathan said. Yes, which means the investigation moves from regulatory to criminal territory significantly faster than it would have otherwise. A pause. Nathan, they're going to want to talk to you again, formally this time with a full deposition, this week, if possible. I expected that. Are you prepared? I've been prepared for 16 years, he said. That's the thing about waiting. You get very prepared. The third thing that happened at 4:15 was that Elena's phone rang with a call from a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it the same way she'd been answering unknown numbers all week, and the voice on the other end was a woman she didn't know. Ms. Brooks, the woman said, my name is Sandra Park. I'm a reporter with the Harwick Courier. I've been covering Titan Corp's regulatory situation today, and I'd like to speak with you about your role in the compliance hold. Elena looked at Nathan across the coffee shop table. He raised an eyebrow. She held up one finger. Ms. Park, she said, how did you get this number? I have a source inside the building who, I'm going to refer you to my attorney, Elena said, and gave her Harriet's number and hung up. Nathan was still looking at her. Reporter? Harwick Courier. That's the second largest paper in the state. He looked out the window. It's starting to go public. It was going to. I know. He didn't sound unhappy about it exactly, more like someone hearing a clock strike the hour they'd been anticipating. Once it goes public, Titan Corp's position gets harder. Public pressure on the board, public pressure on the banking partners. The company's options narrow. Is that what you want? He thought about it, really thought about it, not as a reflex. I want the system to be properly managed. I want the people who falsified the documentation to face consequences proportional to what they did. I want the workers in those warehouses to be safe. He paused. What happens to Titan Corp's stock price or its brand reputation? I don't have strong feelings about that. Corporations aren't people. They don't suffer. The people inside them do. And the thing I care about is making sure the right people face the right consequences, and the people who just showed up and did their jobs don't pay for what their bosses decided. Elena looked at him. She'd known this man for 4 days. In 4 days, she'd driven to his house uninvited, been present for the activation of a compliance hold that had set off the biggest corporate crisis in Harwick in a decade, watched through glass while a CEO's career ended, and was now sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building where it had started. And the thing she felt most clearly was that she understood him. Not completely. She'd known him 4 days, But the shape of who he was had become legible to her in the way that people become legible when you watch them make decisions under pressure. He was precise and he was stubborn, and he was not as over this as he'd spent 16 years pretending to be. And he cared about the work in the way that people only care about work they built with their own hands. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "After." He looked at her. "After is still a few days away." "I know, but you've been thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a gap in the industry," he said. "Has been for a long time. The warehouse management systems running at scale, not just Titan cores, most of them were certified in the early 2000s and have been living on renewals since then. The certification process itself is fragmented and inconsistent. If you wanted to falsify your way through it, Titan Core is not the only company that's found the door unlocked." He paused. "An independent licensing body, not attached to any single company. Engineering review, safety certification, transparent documentation. Something with teeth. You'd run it?" "I'd build it. I'd probably step back from running it once it was functional. I'm not an administrator, I'm an engineer. But I'd build the architecture." He looked at her. "There are things I can do in retirement and things I can do if I'm actually working. I've been retired. It's quieter than I expected, and not entirely in a good way." Elena thought about that. About a man who'd built a system so precise that it had held a company's secrets in its own architecture for 16 years, waiting to be asked. About a craftsman house in Delman, with bookshelves full of technical manuals and a drafting table in the corner with something on it she hadn't had time to identify. About the gap between a system that works and a system that's certified to work, and how catastrophically different those two things could be when someone decided the gap was a place to hide. "I think that's the right thing to do," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm going to do it." Mound. By 6 o'clock, Titan Core's communications department had issued 3 separate press statements, each one walking back or qualifying something in the previous one, which is what happens when a communications strategy is being written by committee under crisis conditions without clear direction from the top. Celeste's suspension had not been publicly announced. The board was managing the disclosure, but the Harwick Courier had the outline of it by 5:30, which meant Sandra Park had a source inside the boardroom or very close to it. Philip Rast left the building at 6:15. He walked through the lobby without his jacket. He'd left it somewhere on the 23rd floor, and got into a car that was waiting for him, and the car took him to his own attorney's office, which was not the same as Titan Core's legal team, which was a distinction that would matter very much in the months ahead. 2 junior executives from the operations division, following Carl Breyer's lead at a distance, made their own calls to their own attorneys in the early evening. The conversations were tentative, probing, the conversations of people who are testing how cold the water is before they decide whether to jump. At 7, Gerald Fitch called Nathan again. "The board is meeting tomorrow morning to appoint interim leadership," he said. "External candidate, independent of the current executive structure. I want you on the call." "As what?" "As someone who understands the system better than anyone else alive, and whose participation in the recovery process would carry significant weight with the FISC and the banking partners." A pause. "I'm not asking you to come back to Titan Core, Nathan. I'm asking you to help us not make the transition worse than it already is. Nathan was in his hotel room in Harwick. He'd booked a room that afternoon, acknowledging that this was going to take more than one day. Looking at the ceiling in the particular way he'd looked at his kitchen ceiling in Delman the morning Elena had shown up at his door. "All right," he said, "I'll be on the call." He sat up and looked at the room, a standard hotel room with its neutral everything, its distance from anything personal. He'd spent a lot of years in rooms like this, early in his career, when the work took him to different cities and the work was all there was. He thought about the compliance lock he'd built into his system's architecture in 2003. The digital safeguard he'd written into the code and the quiet certainty that someone, someday, would need it. He'd told himself it was just good engineering, redundancy, protection against future failure. He wondered, in the honest part of himself that didn't dress things up, whether he'd built it because he'd already known in 2003 that it would eventually come to this. That the company he was building with people he was beginning to distrust would require a mechanism he could activate from outside. In 16 years or 20, or whenever the distance between what he'd built and what they'd done with it became something he could no longer account for by staying quiet. He'd been very patient. He picked up his phone and texted Elena. "Gerald's calling a board meeting tomorrow morning, interim leadership. I'm on the call. Let Harriet know." Her response came back in 2 minutes. "Already did. She says the FISC is moving to expand the investigation scope. More modules, more years. Could go back to 2015. Nathan looked at that for a moment. 2015 meant 8 years of falsified certifications. It meant thousands of documents. It meant the problem was significantly larger than what Elena had found in the records room on her first morning, which was the thing he'd feared but not said out loud, because saying it out loud before he had evidence was not the kind of thing he did. He typed back, "I know. We deal with what's in front of us." She replied, "Yeah." Then, after a pause, "Nathan, the thing you said about building the independent licensing body, I've been thinking about the structure of it." He looked at the ceiling again. Outside, Harwick was doing whatever Harwick did at 7 in the evening, restaurants filling up, the last of the office workers heading home, the ordinary business of a city that was going to look different tomorrow when the news fully broke and people started connecting the story to the glass tower they passed every day. He typed, "Tell me." And she did. For the next 45 minutes, back and forth, the two of them working through it with the specific focused energy of people who are constitutionally incapable of letting a problem sit unexamined. It wasn't elegant, what they came up with that first evening. It was rough and incomplete, and they disagreed on 2 structural points that neither of them resolved before they said good night. But it was the beginning of something real, built by 2 people who had each, in their own way, spent years doing honest work in rooms where honesty wasn't what the room was designed for. Tomorrow there would be board meetings, and federal depositions, and press statements, and the long grinding machinery of institutional accountability beginning its slow work. Tonight there was a hotel room in Harwick, and a woman in an apartment 60 miles away, and a text thread that looked, to anyone reading it out of context, like 2 engineers arguing about governance structure. Which was exactly what it was. The interim CEO they appointed was a woman named Louise Tan, who had spent the previous 12 years running operational turnarounds for distressed industrial companies and had the particular quality of someone who didn't need to be liked to be effective. She took the role on a Thursday, 2 days after the board vote, and by Friday afternoon she had canceled 3 pending vendor contracts that she described in her first internal memo as liabilities masquerading as assets, restructured the communications team under a single point of authority, and sat down with Director Cho for a 2-hour meeting that Titan Core's previous executive team had been avoiding for the better part of a week. She also called Nathan. He took the call on the road. He'd driven back to Delman the previous evening to get clothes and some documents he needed, and he was driving back to Harwick when his phone rang through the car speakers. Louise Tan had a voice that was direct without being abrasive. The voice of someone who had learned to say difficult things without building up to them. "I've read the licensing agreement in full," she said. "Section 14C, your co-authority provision. I want you to know that this administration intends to honor it, not contest it." "I appreciate that," Nathan said. "I'm not saying it to be appreciated. I'm saying it because fighting you would cost us time and credibility we don't have. I need the system recertified, and I need it done by a licensed engineer whose credibility the FISC will accept. Right now, the only person in the world who fits that description is you." Nathan drove for a moment without responding. Outside, the interstate stretched flat through the middle distance, the kind of late-morning light that makes everything look slightly more straightforward than it is. "What are you offering?" he said. "A formal recertification contract, paid engagement. You review every module, every modification made since 2006, every system update. You tell me what's sound and what needs to be corrected before we can bring the system back online. We don't operate a single facility in standby mode until you sign off on it." "That's going to take months." "I know." "And the facilities in the meantime, we're running on manual protocols. We've brought in temporary operations coordinators at the 12 largest facilities. It's expensive and it's slow and it's significantly less efficient than the automated system, which is why I need the system recertified as fast as we can do it correctly." A pause. "I said correctly. I'm aware of what cutting corners on this looked like the last time." Nathan looked at the road. "There's one condition." "Tell me." "I don't work for Titan Core."
I work on the system. The distinction matters because when I find problems, and I will find problems given the modifications they made without proper engineering review, I need to be able to report them to the FISC directly and transparently without running them through corporate legal first. A brief pause. That's going to make our lawyers uncomfortable. I know. Do we have an agreement? Louise Ton took exactly 3 seconds to decide. Yes, she said. The FISC investigation expanded the way investigations do when the first thread is pulled, and what comes with it is more thread. Not in a clean unwinding, but in a tangle that gets larger before it gets smaller. By the end of the first week, Director Cho's team had confirmed that the falsified certifications dated to 2016, not 2019. 8 years of forged documentation across 11 system modules. The number of individual falsified sign-offs eventually reached 231. Carl Breyer gave his cooperation deposition in week 2. He'd been directed, he said, to manage the certification renewal process administratively, starting in 2016, when the Operations Division had been informed that Nathan Brooks was refusing to certify modifications made to the system without a full engineering review he hadn't been consulted on. The solution, handed down from the executive level, had been to handle the certifications internally. When Breyer had asked who was going to sign off on them, he'd been told, in language that was carefully imprecise, that it would be handled. He'd let it be handled. For 8 years. And he'd watched the maintenance logs and the audit flags and Naomi Carter's increasingly urgent internal memos. And he'd done what people do when they've been inside a thing long enough that the wrongness of it has become part of the texture of everyday life. He'd found ways to not look directly at it. I told myself it was a technical problem, he said in his deposition. A paperwork issue. The system was working. Nobody got hurt. I told myself those things were related. If the system works, the paperwork must be fine enough. He paused. The problem with that logic is it only holds until it doesn't. Naomi Carter's deposition came in week 3, and she arrived at the federal building in downtown Harwick in a dark blazer and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this room for 2 years and was not going to waste the time she'd spent waiting. She was precise and thorough, and she had the documentation to back everything she said, which was the advantage of having spent 2 years building a record with a compliance auditor's attention to detail, while everyone around her was paying attention to other things. When the lead investigator asked her why she had not reported her findings externally sooner, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I was afraid, and because I convinced myself that being afraid was the same as being prudent," which is the lie people tell themselves when they want to keep their jobs and also keep their conscience from bothering them too much. She looked at the table. "I'm not proud of it. I'm also done pretending it was something else." The investigator wrote something down. Naomi looked at her own hands. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself ahead of time. That doesn't feel like courage until after, when you look back and see where the line was, and realize you crossed it while you were busy being scared. Naomi Carter had crossed it in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning when she opened her folders for a woman she'd met 3 days ago, and the crossing hadn't felt like anything except necessary. The courage was only visible in retrospect, which was true of most courage, and the fact that she hadn't felt it at the time didn't make it less real. Celeste Mercer was formally charged in week 4. The charges were federal, wire fraud, falsification of regulatory documents, obstruction of a federal investigation. Her attorney issued a statement describing the charges as politically motivated overreach based on a mischaracterization of standard executive oversight practices, which was the kind of statement you issue when the evidence is substantial and your options for saying anything better are limited. She had resigned from Titan Corps' board the week before, in a letter that was 4 sentences long and contained no admission of wrongdoing and no acknowledgement of the people whose concerns she'd suppressed for 8 years. Elena read the letter when it was reported in the Harwick Courier and felt, mostly, the absence of what wasn't in it. Not anger. The anger had burned off somewhere in the first week, replaced by the duller and more honest feeling of watching institutional accountability do its work with its characteristic slowness and imperfection. The charges against Celeste were the beginning of a legal process that would take years, because these things always do. The outcome was not guaranteed because these things never are. What was guaranteed was that the documentation existed, that it was in federal hands, and that 231 forged certifications and a 2-year internal paper trail and a forensic report and a recorded phone call from March of 2022 were not things that could be made to disappear. Harriet Voss had spent her career making sure that things like this didn't disappear, and she was very good at her job. Philip Rast negotiated a settlement that included his resignation, a substantial financial penalty, and a cooperation agreement that gave the FISC access to Titan Corp's executive communications going back 7 years. His attorney described it as accepting responsibility for failures of oversight. Whether it was enough was a question that people who'd worked under him for years answered differently depending on what they'd seen and how much they'd lost. Quote, Nathan spent 11 weeks doing what Louise Tan had hired him to do, which was to go through the system he'd built 20 years ago with the attention of someone who knows where the bodies are buried because they built the place where the bodies could be buried. What he found was not uniformly bad. The core architecture was sound. He'd built it to be sound. And foundational soundness is hard to compromise without also compromising the function of the thing, which would have been noticed. The modifications made since 2006 were inconsistent. Some were competent engineering done by people who understood the system well enough to extend it carefully. Others were shortcuts that had accumulated into structural vulnerabilities the way debt accumulates when you keep extending the credit line and never look at the principal. He documented everything. The sound pieces and the compromise pieces and the pieces that were somewhere in between and required judgment calls that he made slowly and explained in writing and submitted to the FISC with his reasoning laid out step by step, the way he'd always worked. Not fast, not impressively, but correctly. There were 12 modules that required significant remediation before he would certify them. He said so in writing. Louise Tan did not push back, which had been the condition of the agreement, and the remediation work was contracted to 3 engineering firms that Nathan reviewed and approved, and the work took the time it took, which was longer than anyone wanted and shorter than it could have been. He worked mostly from a rented office in Harwick, because driving 3 hours to Delman and 3 hours back was not a sustainable arrangement for an 11-week engagement. He brought some books and a drafting table he bought secondhand, and the rented office looked, by the end of the 3rd week, a great deal like the living room in Delman, which was either a comment on his habits or on the portability of who he was. Elena came by the office on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when her own schedule allowed. She was not working for Nathan. She had her own situation to manage, her own deposition to give, her own professional footing to rebuild after the peculiar damage of being publicly identified as the person whose first day at work had started a federal investigation. It was not an easy thing to explain on a resume, which she'd pointed out to Harriet with the dry humor of someone who'd been through enough to know that dark humor was a legitimate coping strategy. You could frame it differently, Harriet had said. As what? Whistleblower with a very short employment history? As a compliance analyst with direct involvement in the largest industrial safety enforcement action in the state in 15 years. Harriet had said it without irony. That's not nothing, Elena. It was not nothing. It was also not simple, because nothing about the preceding weeks had been simple, and the part of Elena that was practical and honest with herself knew that the gold star feeling she'd had about the Titan Corp offer letter was not going to be easy to replicate for a while. Not because of regret. She'd replay the same decisions if given the choice, and she knew this clearly enough that she didn't spend much time questioning it, but because the thing she'd wanted, the meaningful work in a significant company doing something that mattered, had turned out to be true and false at the same time. Titan Corp was significant. The work was real. And it had been built, in part, on a foundation that somebody had decided to quietly rot. She thought about that a lot in the weeks after. The way institutions can be genuinely important and genuinely corrupt at the same time, without the importance canceling the corruption or the corruption erasing what was real. She'd gone into compliance work because she believed in systems, in the idea that documented truth was a form of protection. She still believed it, but she understood now what she'd understood only abstractly before. The documentation protects the truth only if someone is willing to do something with what the documentation shows. The forms exist. The sign-off pages exist. The audit flags exist. And if the people who hold them decide that the cost of acting on them is too high, then the documentation just becomes the record of a failure that nobody stopped. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not the dramatic version of it, Not Celeste Mercer's threats, or the federal investigation or the board vote, but the quieter, more uncomfortable version. The maintenance of any system, she had come to understand, required not just people who could identify what was wrong, but people who were willing to say so when saying so cost something. The technical part was almost never the hard part. The hard part was human, and it always had been. The independent licensing body that Nathan had sketched in a hotel room text thread with Elena took 11 months to formalize, which was faster than he'd expected and slower than she'd pushed for. And the gap between those two tempos was a recurring feature of their working relationship. He called it the Industrial Systems Certification Authority, ISCA, and he structured it as a nonprofit with an engineering review board composed of licensed engineers from multiple disciplines, an independent audit function, and a public documentation requirement that made every certification, every flag, and every remediation record available for external review. The transparency piece had been Elena's contribution, not the idea of transparency, which was obvious, but the specific architecture of it, the way the public database was structured so that a compliance analyst or a regulator or a journalist or a worker who wanted to know whether the warehouse they went to every day had been properly certified could find out in 40 minutes rather than in a records room on their first day at a new job. Nathan had looked at the database structure she'd proposed and said, "This is going to make a lot of companies uncomfortable." "Good," Elena had said. "I mean that as a practical concern, not a moral objection. If we make the certification requirement feel punitive, companies will find ways to resist it rather than comply with it. If we make it easy to hide problems, people will hide problems. We've established what that looks like." They disagreed about the balance of that for 3 weeks, through a series of conversations that had the specific friction of two people who are both right about different parts of the same problem. What they arrived at was a structure that was demanding without being combative, the public database with a built-in explanation system, so that a flag in the records came with context, with the company's response, with the resolution timeline, with the engineer's sign-off on the resolution. Not a shame mechanism. A record. A living, accurate, accessible record of the truth of how a system was running and who had been paying attention. ISCA formally opened its doors on a Monday morning in spring, 14 months after Elena Brooks had opened a filing cabinet in a records room in Harwick and found a signature that didn't match. Nathan signed the founding documents in Harriet Voss's conference room, with Harriet notarizing and Elena watching from across the table, and he held the pen for a moment before he put it down. Not from sentiment exactly, but from the particular awareness of a man who knows that the thing he is signing is the thing he should have been allowed to build 20 years ago and wasn't, and who has decided not to waste the energy being bitter about the delay. He signed, and the pen went down, and Harriet said something wry about billing, and Elena laughed, and the moment passed into the next moment, the way moments do. Naomi Carter was appointed Director of Compliance at ISCA 6 months after it opened, which was not something Elena had engineered exactly, but which also did not happen without Elena making sure Naomi's name was in the room when the position was being discussed. Naomi had been through her own lengthy process with Titan Corps severance and the federal witness protections and the careful, grinding work of reestablishing herself professionally in an industry where her name was now connected to the biggest whistleblower case in the state's recent history. That connection was an asset and a complication in roughly equal measure, which was true of most things that were worth anything. She took the ISCA position because it was the right work, and she said as much in the one conversation she and Elena had about it. They were at Patton's Diner, the one where Elena had met Nathan on the night of the board meeting, and Naomi was looking at the offer letter that Elena had slid across the table, and she was quiet for a moment. "I spent 2 years building a paper trail that I didn't use," Naomi said. "I knew what was right, and I waited for someone else to go first." "You used it when it mattered," Elena said. "I used it when I had cover." She looked at the letter. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." Elena thought about the right thing to say. She thought about Naomi at her kitchen table in the early morning, folders open, earring in hand, 3 expressions crossing her face, in rapid succession when she'd found Elena on her doorstep. She thought about what it cost to sit with knowledge for 2 years in a building that punished the wrong kind of attention, and the specific kind of strength it required not to talk yourself into believing the problem would resolve itself. You did the right thing imperfectly, Elena said. That's most of what doing the right thing looks like. Naomi looked at her. Then she looked back at the offer letter. The compliance work at ISCA, it would be different. It would be the same work with the documentation actually going somewhere. And Nathan's comfortable with the position being mine? He proposed it, Elena said. Not because he feels he owes you something, because you're the best qualified person for it, and he knows that, and he doesn't let other things get in the way of knowing things like that. Naomi picked up the pen from the table. She held it for a moment, the same way Nathan had held the pen in Harriet's office, and then she signed and put the pen down. Okay, she said. It got. The Titan Core system came back online in its recertified form 8 months after the suspension, under the management of Louise Tan, and with Nathan's engineering sign-off on every module. It was not the same system it had been. 11 of the 12 modules that required remediation had been rebuilt in whole or in part, and the modifications made since 2006 had been either certified properly or removed and replaced. It was slower to come back than the banks wanted, and the distribution partners wanted, and the 4,000 Titan Core employees who'd spent 8 months watching their company run on manual protocols and reduced capacity wanted. But it came back correctly, and what that meant in practical terms was that the first time a maintenance flag appeared in the system after the relaunch, it went into a public ISCA record within 48 hours, where anyone who wanted to look could see it. Nobody tried to suppress it. Louise Tan's response to the flag was a remediation work order issued within 72 hours, the kind of response that would have been ordinary in a well-run company and was, in this company, a sign of something having actually changed. Titan Core did not disappear. Elena had thought, in the early weeks of the crisis, that it might, that the weight of everything it had done wrong would be sufficient to collapse it. What happened instead was what happens to most large institutions when they are forced to reckon with serious failures without being destroyed by them. They changed, partially and imperfectly, retaining what was functional and discarding what had become too costly to defend. The brand was damaged. The stock took 2 years to recover to pre-crisis levels. Celeste Mercer's trial was still ongoing. Philip Rast had paid what he owed and was working in a smaller firm in a different city and keeping a low profile in the way of people who have traded their ambitions for a quieter conscience. Gerald Fitch remained on the board and became, in the years after, the kind of voice that boards sometimes develop after a serious failure. Not a hero exactly, but a cautionary function. The person who remembered what happened the last time something was allowed to go unexamined. He called Nathan occasionally. The calls were brief and professional and had the quality of two people who had found their way to a mutual respect through a situation that neither of them had handled perfectly, and both of them knew it. Elena did not take a position at ISCA, which surprised some people, and did not surprise Nathan. She understood why they expected her to. She'd been part of building it. She knew its structure better than almost anyone. She had the credentials and the specific experience and the credibility that came from being the person who'd started the whole thing by doing her job on a Tuesday morning when she didn't have to. But ISCA was Nathan's institution to build and run. Her being there would have been, in the useful word Nathan himself used when she raised it, redundant. She had her own work to do, and she needed to do it somewhere that was hers. She spent 2 months looking, which felt long and was actually not long at all, given what she'd been through. She took a position at a smaller logistics company in a city 3 hours from Harwick, doing the compliance work she'd always done, for less money than Titan Core had offered, and more authority than any position she'd held before. The company was not glamorous, the work was not dramatic, the documentation requirements were thorough, and the audit processes were solid, and when she found something that didn't add up, she said so in writing, and she said so to the right people, and she kept a record. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference now was that she understood, in a way she hadn't entirely understood before, what the work was actually for. Not compliance for its own sake, not documentation as an end in itself, but the idea that the gap between what a system does and what it's supposed to do is always a place where someone's decision lives. A person who looked at that gap and chose to account for it honestly or chose not to. She had decided to account for things honestly, and the decision had cost her something, and she would make it again. That was not a comfortable thing to know about yourself, but it was a true thing, and she'd learned enough by now to understand that true things were generally better to live with than comfortable ones, even when they weren't easier. She kept in contact with Nathan. Not frequently. He was not a frequent contact kind of person, and neither, particularly, was she. But consistently, in the way of people who have been through something significant together and come out the other side with a clear-eyed respect for who the other person actually is. He sent her the ISCA quarterly reports because she designed the database structure and had a professional interest. She sent him occasional questions about engineering certification edge cases that came up in her work, because he was the best person to ask, and he always answered. Once, about a year after everything, she drove back to Harwick on a Saturday for no particular reason she could articulate. Not for a meeting, not for work, just to see it. She drove past the tower, still glass and steel, still with its particular quality of compressed ambition, still taller than it needed to be. The lobby was visible from the street, the dark marble and the indirect lighting, the reception desk. She didn't stop. She drove through and kept going, out the other side of the city and back toward the interstate. She thought about the records room on the 14th floor and the filing cabinet and the signature that didn't match. She thought about how small that moment was in the physical sense. A woman at a workstation, a document in a binder, a detail that was either a bureaucratic error or the edge of something much larger. She'd been in the building for 2 hours. She'd had 37 photographs and enough sense to know that sense alone wasn't sufficient. She thought about all the rooms and all the buildings where someone finds something that doesn't add up, and looks at it, and calculates the cost of saying so, and decides the cost is too high, and puts it back in the binder, and closes the filing cabinet and goes on with their day. She understood those decisions now better than she had before. She didn't endorse them, but she understood them, which was different, and she thought more honest. Fear is not a character flaw. The willingness to be scared and do something anyway is not a virtue you're born with. It's a decision you make, and then make again, and then make again, every time the situation requires it, with no guarantee that the next time will feel any easier than the last. The road opened up past the city limits, and she drove, and Harwick disappeared in the rearview mirror, and she thought about what Nathan had said in his kitchen on that first morning, when she'd asked why he hadn't activated the compliance hold years ago. I kept telling myself there was a less drastic way to handle things. She'd understood it as hesitation then. She understood it differently now. Not as weakness, but as the honest account of a man who had tried, for 16 years, to believe that the world would correct itself without requiring him to force it. That patience is not always wrong. That sometimes you wait and the thing resolves. And that sometimes you wait and the thing compounds, quietly, in filing cabinets and maintenance logs, and the internal memos of careful people that nobody reads, until someone opens a cabinet on a Tuesday morning and the distance between what's documented and what's true becomes impossible to ignore. The truth doesn't disappear because nobody is looking at it. It just waits. That was the thing, in the end, that she carried with her, not the outcome. The investigation, the charges, the certifications, the institution Nathan built. Those mattered, and they were real, and they had changed the texture of an industry in ways that would take years to fully trace. But what she carried was something smaller and more durable, the understanding that the truth of any system, no matter how deeply it's been buried or how carefully it's been papered over, requires only one thing to survive: someone willing to look at it directly and say what they see. She drove home as the afternoon light shifted west, and the road was ordinary, and she was tired in the good way, the way you're tired when you've done the work that needed doing. And the miles went by without drama, which was fine. That was fine.